welcome. My name is Elin Grinaker. I am the program dramaturg at Black Box Theater. And I want to welcome to this artist talk between Ligia Lewis and Duduzile Mathonsi. Ligia presented her minor matter here yesterday. It was really good. I loved it. Thank you. Duduzile is a multi-faceted artist and writer. You're a former journalist. You have a diploma in linguistics, and you also have worked as an entertainer. And currently, you're a student at the Norwegian Theatre Academy in Fredrikstad. And last weekend, she premiered with her solo performance, Bitch, Where the Fuck Is My Manifesto, where she's exploring the narratives of the black female body, looking at the concepts of the spectator versus the spectacle as a means of decolonization. We have this, it looks like we're live streaming, but we are recording, just for your information. So I'm just looking very much forward to listening to you, and I give you back the microphone.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'd like to introduce Ligia Lewis. I hope I pronounced that well. And she is a Berlin-based artist that works as a dancer and choreographer. Anything else?
That's fine.
Okay, great. So I just want to start off, start off. You want to talk about the performance?
Sure. I don't know how many of you had a chance to see the work last night. Okay, cool. That helps in a way. So I'm not speaking totally in the abstract, but I created Minor Matter in 2016. Its first iteration began in 2015, a direct response to what began as Black Lives Matter, specifically in Los Angeles, and the movement for Black Lives. I created a sort of response within the frame of a white cube space called Human Resources in Los Angeles. And that was sort of the starting point. It was a solo protagonist inside of the work. And then I chose to sort of transpose that work and the ideas that began there to the black box, and then began the process in the actual creation process in 2016. The work is interrogating so many, how could I describe this work? Wow. Well, I was interested more abstractly in this idea of like race and representation, and thinking through the sort of poetics of affect and embodiment, and how that could sort of translate into a choreography, and thinking about this choreography as being social, and also at the same time holding on to sort of antagonism towards representation, despite the fact that it in the end is representation, because it does happen in the frame of the black box. And how could I sort of construct a world in which multiplicity and difference sort of unfolds, and also creating a links in like a sort of poetics through like Black diaspora, the original performers being a Dominican-American dancer, now choreographer, Jonathan Gonzalez, and Tami Mankela from South Africa, and myself. And there are 3 subject positions, but in a way, I was interested in subjectivity up to a certain point, and then sort of the work sort of turns towards the end where it becomes less about subjectivity and more about entanglement and undifferentiated bodies, actually, as sort of a blob of the social, whatever. And yeah, so I worked I began the work with the sort of logic for sound, which was, it's a sound score that begins with early Renaissance music, and what I describe as like arriving into the immediate present, which is the soundtrack ends and you hear the clamor of the dancers' bodies, kind of, and so we arrive in the immediate present. And so there was a sort of kind of poetics of time and space and sort of the construction of the work. And yeah. And I was also I've been working with color, and I was using the color red to materialize thoughts between love and rage. So sort of turning the black box into an affective realm and world, and creating a sort of space of worlding with 2 other black protagonists.
you talk about moving the work into the black box, and I want to talk about moving the work, whether it's in the black box or anywhere, but just transporting this work that you've created somewhere and putting it into another place, no matter where you are in the world. I don't know if you can talk a little bit more about this. In what I have found that sometimes when I create something, the moving process is so challenging sometimes, especially if you have indigenized the space that you started with and having to re-indigenize the space that you move into in order to create this performance.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a really good question. So in a way, like when we were rehearsing, we were always treating the space as ours, as an intimate space that we sort of have agency over. And so transposing that to the black box required some imagination and also kind of conviction amongst the three of us to constantly be at play with the intimacy of the space that we're in. And so that's the challenge of the choreography, right? And so the black box became a kind of metaphor for me to claim the space as black, actually, and to think of the black box also as a black body that could hold these three bodies, not through like a transparent lens, which is one that we understand more from like political representation, but more through a certain poetics of opacity. So it's also challenging sort of the visible, and that's why like sound is so privileged inside of this piece as well, and creating a space that could become sort of through the clamor of our bodies, like intimate and ours, and that's always the challenge. So every time we enter into a new space, we of course have a rehearsal there, and we always find new assemblages to create inside of the space, inside of that frame. So it always feels, there's always a quality of newness to the piece, and there's always an invitation to be super alive inside of that space, to kind of constantly challenge it as being, well, it's not a neutral space, as we know, but also to play with our own mark and trace inside of that space.
I also forgot to say that we are open for questions during the conversation. So it's a communal conversation. It's not just you guys watching us two talk. So at any given point, not necessarily as an interruption, but if you have a question, are you happy with opening it up?
Oh, absolutely.
Yes. So if you have any questions, maybe this is the right time to start with the first round. If anybody has any other questions about the work or?
Well, first, thank you for the piece. Yeah. It was very inspiring to watch yesterday. And I was very catched by the music. So if you could talk a little bit, how do you work, or if it's how you work, which kind of musician or the soundtracks made, how it's made, it would be
Absolutely.
Nice. Thank you.
For this piece, I worked with a musicologist, Michał Libera. He's Warsaw-based, and we met over a conversation in a museum in Warsaw, actually, and he like recommended a book to me on music, and it was very compelling. And then I invited him a few months later to join me in this process. So what we did is we agreed that there would be a logic for sound, and I sort of established that, and I wanted to give this feeling of futurity, and how could I do that with a logic of sound. And so we began with playing with like history of modern music, and which begins with early Renaissance music, and that also marks a very important moment in modern history as well for Black life. So that was very clear. And so in the process, we had because he was based in Warsaw at the time. I think I was in Los Angeles when I was starting to like conceive of how this might sort of translate itself to the theater. And we just were having a number of conversations, and he sent over like 200 files of music. And so just sifting through music together, sort of building a logic. I knew I wanted to work on the iconic track of Ravel's Bolero, which is Carl Craig's remix with Morris Oswald. And they created this sort of hybrid Ravel. It's the Ravel that turns into a house track, the Bolero, which we do the step, which is very iconic. And so to sort of build around that track. And it was just like a lot of trial and error, to be honest. And and things are morphed. I mean, some things are legible or audible, other things are not. So we were really playing also on the level, like there's so many tracks inside of that, and it's constantly shifting, and that was just the logic of the piece as well, to have this kind of shape-shifting object, so you can never totally grab it, and also to give a feeling of time passing, and the sense of time, sense of history. So, and then I was also interested in it not being linear also, and yeah. And it was also like, how does that meet the work? So it was basically working on the soundtrack all the way until, I think the day before, the dress rehearsal. We kind of were shifting things around. And so, yeah.
Speaking of shape shifting, it's interesting. I wanted. I'm thinking of the Black female body, and constantly shape shifting, constantly being the chameleon, and in that process of how do you think that? Do you think that your piece talks about things like that, or do you think it is interpreted however whoever sees the piece interprets it?
Yeah, in general, I kind of like to allow the audience to sort of find their way into the work. Like I try to resist this kind of transparent way of dealing with a certain politics, because I think that's also too easy, and also it never lends itself to actual, like, complex. Like sometimes I think it limits the complexity or nuance of a situation or of a topic, but to speak specifically about like gender, or I was kind of interested in this piece as sort of ungendering. So to undo this kind of logic of gender difference, and why it was, well, I was trying to be able to like equally carry the boy, like we're throwing each other around, like kind of equally, so this process of kind of undoing a sort of learned difference that I think is totally unnecessary, and it speaks also very specifically to Black life as well, where I feel like these sort of gender difference is not as intensely articulated. I think that's more of sort of Western European concept, and something that I was just effectively trying to undo or inside of this piece, and once again, I mean, there's a certain kind of poetics of the fleshiness of the body, which I think I'm interested in also, and what that has come to mean, and how that illegible that has been made to be, and I'm interested in that, and its inability to be like made entirely legible. I don't know.
I mean, speaking of the flesh, we've been having some talks a bit, and just being in this flesh, there was something that you said about in the beginning about if I were to undo the skin, or what's that first line? If
I would like to step in. I would like to step inside of your skin. So for me, it's both the poetics of the black box and sort of what's going to unfold, as well as this sort of relation that I'm trying to establish amongst the performers. That we are actually effectively trying to enter into each other's skin to become more than one. More, to be,
And looking at it as how Black has become like a format for all of us, and somehow eliminating our differences and just classifying us as a people who have the same agencies, which we don't have.
Yeah, totally.
And being an African, and you being from the Dominican Republic, and although we're both women of color, there's so many disagreements and agreements that we have in terms of politics, in terms of what it means to be a woman in the world. And I think there was something in the piece that really resonated with me, where you said, is it bad bitches? No, hold on. Assertive bitches, right? And I thought to myself, how assertion sometimes can be taken as aggression, or a bit of too much, or taking up too much space. And then coming back to the female Black body is how how we're always seen as taking space, rather than our bodies just needing space to exist. And so I found that really resonated with me, of how do we now start finding ways of moving in spaces, whether it's white spaces, whether it's black spaces, whatever spaces? How is the black female body, or any black body for that instance, allowed to walk or find its way to walk into spaces without having to figure out in what chameleon body do I walk into the space today?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. I don't think that could be simply answered. I think that's like it's very specific to context, to place, to time. It's, yeah, we were having this conversation yesterday about this thing of this need to take space, but at times you also want to retreat and disappear. Like, and I think those things are have to sort of coexist, because at this moment, in a moment of hypervisibility, I don't necessarily entirely believe that that is like the goal, right? Is to be made visible or legible to a white dominant order. So there are times strategically where one chooses to be in the periphery, out of both the need for safety, but also because we recognize that that's often where the real work is happening. So in terms of taking space, and I think it's really determined on personalities, politics, individual needs, the time in which those things are needed. Yeah. Yeah, that's all I could. That's all. Yeah, I don't have a general answer for that, but just it is something to think about. Absolutely, and no space is neutral, and a lot of these spaces, when we say white space or black space, I think we could agree on that we're speaking about spaces and what's practiced there. So if there's if the institution is practicing exclusionary practices, then we would call that a white space. If it's historically exclusionary, you know, and if it's exclusive and it's elitist, if it's, you know, there are a number of different ways in which we could determine that. So I guess, yeah, just to specify that. Yeah, and of course, in these sort of like exclusive spaces, it's very difficult to enter, and I prefer to be like, you know, like a fly, like up on against the edge and just like observe, and I don't always feel it's necessary to participate fully, but yeah, but to be in a space of observation and to find the spaces and the moments where I feel like it's necessary to participate and to play.
I find that very interesting, because I think, for those of you who don't know, I'm a South African, born and raised, and I was born in apartheid, raised in the transition and in post. So there's this weird line of having experienced, or whether remembering or my body remembering. And I think these certain spaces of allowance somehow has, for me, been very present of where you're allowed to be and where you're not. Remembering the first time where I was allowed, or my parents moved to suburbia, where we had white neighbors. And the system allowed us the space, but the space didn't allow us to be in the space, which was an interesting context, I think, because by law, I'm allowed to sit next to you. But just a couple of years ago, I was not even allowed to sit next to you on the bus. And just this tension that arrives there. So I think by the time I arrived to Norway, it was more of, I've been fighting for space for so long and not realizing that it was an archive that I've been carrying, that there's a constant fight for space, and no matter what space I arrive into, I need to fight for it, because it's either I'm not going to be given the space, or I'm going to be completely closed off from the space. So I echo you, and I agree from a different perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I come from the American context, yeah, where exclusive practices are very, very common, particularly within the cultural field. But there are also, like representation operates in such a strange way, I feel like, in the American context, where it's like it's always like extreme. It's either like hyper visibility or like total like erasure. And it's very difficult just to be like, a friend of mine, Keon Gaskin, who's also an artist, he and I joke about just being black and regular. You know, you don't want to have to be excellent. You don't want to have to, you know, have to talk about your suffering. You don't want to have to, you know what I mean? You don't want to have to speak to all of these like absurd like narratives that are sort of forced upon you. Just kind of just like, I'm just living and breathing, and I was just listening to this track today, got my life, I'm reading this right here. Like, so there are all these different things where you just actually want to participate in the pleasures of the everyday, and that you don't want to participate in these grand narratives, actually, that they're unnecessary, and that they're maybe, right? Or that maybe these are the very things that we're trying to undo. And because these grand narratives were never actually hold our subjectivities, because these grand narratives have historically been constructed against us. So I think to be just regular is in some ways quite radical in this like contemporary moment.
I think it comes back in the piece where you said that boring, you want to be boring. Somebody said something about being boring. And I'm thinking about the privilege to play, which is not always offered to some of us. And I'm curious in terms of like how you approach your work in having the privilege to play and not having the privilege to play.
You know, I feel, for me, maybe I could just describe like like a choreographic interest of mine, and I use this term playfully, is this idea to create space for like good fuckery is what I call it, or like a space to actually have like uninhibited play and playfulness, because I feel like there is also a radical space of hope and sociality, and a lot of things like emerge there, things that we don't even have language for. And in order to do that, I had to construct a piece in a certain way that enabled that to happen, and for it not to be just like put aside as like, what are these kids doing? Like, why are we here? So I do think that I do find that play and playfulness is, I mean, it's a generative force. It's what very much inspires my practice. I spend a lot of time playing in the studio and with others, and I feel like that's how, that's so much of the creative impulse and impetus for my practice. And it's true, like I have the privilege of having access to studio time through production, through the process of creating a production, and that's what enables me to engage in these kinds of playful practices that might otherwise not be made available to me, right? And I feel fortunate in a lot of ways that I got to make this piece, because it is a lot of fun, and that it's always, for me, it's like super important that all of us are having a good time also, like that it is work, but it's a labor of love also, and that's super important. The moment it feels like we're laboring just for the sake of something other than our own desire, then I feel like, okay, maybe this is not the thing. This has to be for us first, right? So, and then people get to bear witness to it.
I'm curious if anybody has some comments in the meanwhile, or shall we just carry on? Anytime now? Nope? Okay. Yes.
If you could say more about the decolonization practice, like how you work with this theme in your practice, in your choreography, and the aesthetic of your work, or if there is a connection with this or not. Or
sorry, wait, be more specific.
If you in the aesthetic of your choreography and the costumes and how you, all the aesthetic that you are looking for, if there is a specific one, how you think about decolonization, like you feel that your work is really into it in terms of choreography, and how you are placing those bodies and those ideas in this black box. You think like that you are creating a dialogue towards it, like
towards decolonizing. Yeah. I hope so. You know, the only way, you know, decolonizing, it's like a heavy word, right? And it emerges out of a very material like history that, so I have to be very careful if I'm to like appropriate that language of decolonization, because a lot of life and blood was shed over decolonizing processes. So just to affirm that, and just to talk a little bit more about the sort of poetics of what I'm trying to do. And in my own process, I'm decolonizing is like it's an interesting term in some ways. I think it can be useful for artists in the sense that I could only like personalize that, right? That's like, I couldn't speak to that in a like general sense, but maybe I could just think about in my own individual practice and my own experiences, what I felt and what I want to privilege inside of my practice. So there's a sort of arrangement of the body that I think is sort of privileged within a Western European American canon that I didn't relate to. And I haven't, and I'm educated in that canon, right? But I had this incredible Black professor, Dr. James Fraser, and he was like, because I was like loving the postmodern stuff when I was in college, and I was taking Trisha Brown dance class, like workshop, and I was like really feeling it, like I was like, yes, release, okay. And it was a constant thing of like, oh, you're feeling this like too much, or it was always this thing of like tone down or a little less, or be like, disappear, or why does your mark have to be so intense? And you're just like, oh, you know. So then it was, I mean, this is before I really understood that. So I always thought that was wrong. I was like, oh, so there's a certain kind of way in which dance education privileges a certain type of embodiment. And so from my own experience, I was like, okay, well, maybe this mark isn't wrong, it's just different. So we clearly don't understand difference within this canon. So yeah, I just privileged other practices and things that I like and things that I experience in my everyday also. And this arrangement of the body is messier. It's not organized in the same way. It's not built on a logic of autonomy. It's built on another logic. Also the way in which sound, you know, I was just like, at a certain point I was just like, yeah, what if we danced on the beat? Like, I don't know. Like what if we just did that? Because, and not to try to say that that's less than or less valuable than other constructions of meaning, and maybe it's not specifically meaning that I'm after, or a meaning that we understand from a Western European logic, but maybe it's a sensation, or it's an affect, or it's the fact that we're doing it together, just simply that. So, and that meaning emerges sometimes well after the fact of practicing something. So it's just, for me, it was just kind of, this idea of decolonizing was me just kind of going into my own archive as you discussed it, and my own archive of experiences within my own training, and trying to find the things that actually gave me life, that I was excited about, that I think are valuable myself, and to share that and to be in practice with others that agree, you know.
Piggy wagoning on that, I also very much echo that the decolonization process is in your archive. Your body the body is, I find, so intelligent. It's more intelligent than our brains, I think, which is part of the body. But anyway, but I think there's something about the body being able to tap back into memory. It's always, everything it meets, I find, is in constant negotiation with memory. And whether the memory is enforced upon, or it's a memory that's inherited. And there's always going to be a negotiation once it meets something. And I think something that is more easier on you, or more comfortable, or secure rather than comfortable, and safe within the body is always going to somehow refer back to this safeness, and it will fight whatever it is presented with, which is not a safe presentation. I don't know if that kind of makes sense.
Yeah, for sure. I would say that in some part, that's like, for me, intuition is like to trust, you know, and sometimes you have to throw yourself into things that you don't know. And I do think that's an important part of being in the world. And I am grateful for my education. So as much as I am critical of it, I'm also grateful for parts of it. And I do think that I agree with you that we do have the capacity to hold on to certain kind of resistance, and that maybe we don't know immediately why we're resisting, but we can trust that in time
Yeah.
we will know why.
And I think this plays into the performance. There was a part that says, your feelings matter. This is what I wrote. I don't know if this is exactly what happened. And this, for me, comes into whatever you're feeling in that moment. If you're feeling provoked, or if you're feeling, this is not right, it's your feelings or your intuition or your archives telling you, this is not a safe space for you. And I think it comes into whether we fight it or whether we say, not today.
Yeah.
But the energy that I think that takes of having to calculate whether today's the day or today's not the day becomes our personality. And this is where the privilege of play is taken from us, because we can't just sometimes play. You always have to calculate, when can I play and when can I not play? And even in the work, you have to allocate play, but the work can't be all about play somehow. Not that it can't, but there's no space for full-on play. It can be done. I think we should start doing it, but it's not always available.
Totally, and we can't forget the sort of effort that it takes to build the conditions in order to create play, and the labor that takes, and it was not an easy feat, I can say, to first of all get the funding to make this work, and let alone its immediate reception, because I work within the Berlin dance field, and I think people were initially like, what is that? You know, what is this thing? And for a lot of people, they wanted it to be legible to their logic, to their system of understanding, and later this work ended up traveling quite a bit. And it's interesting because then a lot of sensibilities have shifted since, or I don't even know if sensibilities have shifted. No, maybe like opinions about the work have shifted since, which is interesting to also map. But that, it's simply like it's not easy, and to create the conditions for play which are necessary have just never been simple, have never been made accessible to us, and I think the space of play is so essential for particularly, but yes, and for Black and brown, like for othered body, whatever these narratives, because we have to create other possibilities. It's in this field of play that we're creating other forms of social life and other forms of possibility, and that this creative potential is so necessary. And so many like within the Berlin dance scene, everyone's like a Duduzile, and they're all talking about potentiality. But at the same, but it's so neglectful of potential for who or for what, and who are you considering in that potentiality. So it's there's a lot of work.
It's a sense of logic. I'm going to open it up again. Come on, guys. We're a nice, intimate audience. Comments, questions, anything that you're thinking about, throw it our way. 5. It's like the only Black woman is just like, I got questions.
I'm very interested in your work. So, no, I was thinking about all that you said, but also the relation with the music, those layers that we cannot grasp, that you mentioned, no, this historic line or trajectory that you create with the soundtrack. But coming back to my memory from the piece, also I felt this in the dance vocabulary. I don't know if it was work in that direction, but I felt many times that it was this vibration of, or this body memory resonating something, but that it does not become expression, a full expression, but it was like just a reverberating inside. And then it was just a question, like it was like you work in this kind of way with the vocabulary, because sometimes I was like, okay, now it's the revel, so they would dance the classical, or now they would go to the beat, or they would dance like Caribbean, or I mean, it was not my expectation, but I felt that you play with us in that sense, with our expectation, because I think maybe we had this expectation and never come true, and then it was something else. So if you, it was some kind of thing something like that, or
Yeah.
I mean, it was a
I'm
personal feeling, but I felt interesting to just feel this breathing and then coming to the expression of the face. So it was coming through, you know, the like peripheral areas in space and body, but not expression itself that we could recognize, like, oh, this is that. You know what I mean? I don't know if it's clear.
I think so. I feel like also being like a marked body, we're operating predominantly in white spaces. I'm very conscious of the fact that there's an expectation for me to present an essentialized self or an exotic self, that I have to perform my most authentic Black self, whatever that is, for white people to like read me or something. And so I just am trying to, in every way, shape, and form, resist that, and that there are certain things, certain understandings of Blackness that are shared, but also that are also not totally entirely understood, even to myself. Like, and that I could never be representative of something larger than my own experience. And so, yeah, I try to resist creating an essentialized sort of articulation of the body, but it's not anti-essentialist either, so that's also kind of complicated. But it's yeah, I think I use this idea of like the shiftiness. So at the moment that you think you have the thing, it's like slips out of your hands, and then for multiple reasons that I do that, because we all know that like Blackness forever, it's an age-old story, has been the thing that white people love to like feed on in like really different ways, from appropriation to subject. I mean, it's like deep, and it's a long history of that. So in a way, playing with this kind of shiftiness is a way to also be like, to be constantly on the run in a way, because I really feel like in my own experience I'm doing that anyway, like never settling into one immediate context or one, yeah, to continue to like push the opacity of the work and push yeah, those kinds of poetics, if at all possible. I don't know if that answers your question.
I also think, although decolonization is something on its own, this is also a form or a mean of decolonizing somehow, in taking over, not taking over, but not fulfilling the expectations. And within theater spaces or spaces of performance, the Black body in any gender form is always seen as a spectacle, and it's always somehow when it arrives, if the body arrives on stage, it's either it's a spectacle or it's a support. It's never a body on its own. And so I think this is for me, I would say this is also another method of coming into decolonization, in not giving the expectations of what you're expected to perform, because then you are not human. You're a robot. Perform. I press the button, or now I come in. Oh yeah, I kind of missed you not doing this because I expected you to twerk or sing very, very beautifully, but it came out of that. Yep.
Yeah, I just think it's a way to stay resistant in every way possible, including to neoliberalism, which also is like feeding like crazy on Blackness, but in ways that are not necessarily helpful to the Black bodies that are producing this culture, you know? So it's like, yeah, trying to stay resistant, also to stay also for myself in a space of not knowing, never to, like, I try not to commit too intensely to things that I already know. Like, if anything, if I try to create a choreography, I try to create a space where there's always like a space for that animates the playfulness, but it also has like an improvisational quality to it. Because for me, this space of not knowing is a really important space, and it's the possibility that's the space where like failures might happen, and like messiness, illegibility. So inside of these constructions that are inside of these pieces, they're very much, it's the dramaturgy is very much considered, but simultaneously it's like yeah, I'm trying to create these little spaces, there's these little gaps where, yeah, where play can happen, and where things that we don't necessarily know, even for ourselves as Black bodies, know for ourselves, right? Like, how much do you know? Yeah, to just continue to play with this idea of potentiality. I don't know.
I was thinking about, in the piece you talk about doing the work. And there was a question, is it doing the work for, is the phrase doing the work for the allies, or doing the work for ourselves, or both? If you look at...
It's really, I mean, this piece especially is really for us, the ones that are performing, the ones that are at play. And I don't have expectations so much for white people anymore. Like, for white, I don't know. I'd be like, do what you will. I don't know anymore. Like, I don't know how much you need to know, how much like you need to read. Like, it's quite exhausting when to always think of. I mean, to think about allies, of course. I mean, it's wonderful when you're able to have people that you sense are adjacent to your politics, you know. And of course, then I would say that of course they're included in the gesture, right? But in this particular work, it was really for us, and it's so much about what we were busy with. And people get to bear witness to that.
Because I find sometimes that with either neoliberalism or with attempted allies, I find that sometimes people aren't willing to put in the work, but want to have a conversation, but the minute the conversation triggers white fragility, there's a withdrawal. And which I find it's hard in any form being an ally. It's really hard because it tests you as a human. It tests your prejudice, which we all have. It tests how you were brought up or the way of thinking you have. And it's a constant reflection of how to sustain being an ally to someone who doesn't have necessarily, I don't want to say the privilege, but always, for lack of a better word, the privilege to give themselves, to be their own allies somehow. So how to be a support in a way. It was just something that I wanted to put out there.
Yeah, of course.
Anybody? Are you over?
Oh, I wanted to say something
Yes.
about this idea of decolonizing. I want to take off that responsibility a bit from artists or from individuals, and maybe that's something for institutions to really consider, because there's only so much one artist can do within the frame of one piece. You know what I mean? And like, these are. I mean, if anything, this kind of work can maybe like provoke institutions to think differently and to think how can they really hold difference within their frames, and yeah, that's all. That maybe to slide that over more to an institutional questioning.
There was something in the piece that said, I'm sorry, I'm constantly referring to the piece as a point of insert, exit, insert,
Yeah,
exit.
that's cool.
And there was somebody who said, we're fighting for our lives. And I thought to myself, when at the end, this failing, this constant attempt and failing, when you were trying to climb up and thinking about the goalpost always being moved, like, this is what you need to do in order to arrive somehow to privilege. And then you arrive, and it's like, no, we're going there. And then you arrive, and then you never get out of it, and constantly somehow fighting for our lives because we're constantly climbing on each other and giving each other so much support that we don't even get to be in a space of being sometimes. It's always giving so much. But anyway, I wanted you to maybe talk a little bit about that. We're fighting for our lives.
Yeah, well, I mean, the end of the piece for me is the most exciting part. I call it apocalypse. And it's, for me, it's like this prospect of failure has to be very much included in any sort of desire, political will, because that's ultimately, like, as you said, experientially, like, what we're up against, and we have to accept it, that it's inevitably in that failure that we actually learn how to move again and otherwise, and that is inevitably part of having a strong political will inside of a world that seems like just like survival feels impossible. Like, and when I say survival, I mean like in a sort of broad sense where like Black life isn't at every juncture just like subjugated, and yeah, and yeah, and failure is and will inevitably. It's also the space of potential. I don't know. I think that there is a lot of creative possibility within failure, and I've always embraced failure creatively as a generative space to produce things. And this is also a sort of, for me, also a space of resistance. Also, to allow that to be part of creative gesture. Or creative possibility, I don't know.
You speak a lot of resistance, and I just wanted to know what you think resistance is.
Ooh, I can't put it in just like simple. I mean, because it's as you said, it's almost like you don't want to give away your tools, like especially transparently out to the. I mean, these are things that we all have, these like tools that we've like developed in order to like maneuver in the world, and I want to stay resistant to cultural hegemony, to certain ideas of what the body is or what a body can do, and for whom, and for and why, and these things are things that will like I would like to carry throughout my life, and that might mean not having access to certain things but I would rather that than to assume or to be given certain access or privilege in spaces where I know others don't have access, so in certain ways, like that kind of resistance I think is important for myself, is just to continuously demand more and demand the impossible, actually, like really demand it, even and that the desire for something else is so important, and to hold that into your body and to make that part like a integral part of your being is which means that you're going to be up against so much shit, and that you're going to fail all the fucking time, and you're probably going to be miserable, but to prefer that and to choose that still, I think, or that's the desire, and we can't always resist everything, right? We still need to eat. We still want to, so we still want to like do so. Sometimes you want to just relax and like, let it slide. I mean, it's also to know what your own limits are. But I think it's also not bad to think about resistance, not also individually, but amongst how that can be shared amongst a group of folks. And what you can do together in order to create other possibilities. I don't know.
Which somehow takes the body and it's almost like taking back your narrative, taking back the gaze, because the gaze becomes who can have a gaze and who cannot have a gaze, who is allowed to gaze and who is not allowed to gaze. And I somehow see it in terms of like how to take back the narrative within resistance. Maybe this is too far-fetched for what you're saying, but this is the streamline of thought that I had in there. But
I think there, just to speak to this idea of the gaze, I think that I like this term that a friend of mine uses in relationship to her practice, Candace Williams, and she talks about this idea of not only bearing witness, but also bearing withness. So is there a way to see along with what you're looking at, which already pushes aside a power relation. So the gaze already establishes a sort of power relationship to what you're seeing. But I do think there are possibilities and ways in which we can experience differently. And so that it doesn't have to always be you and that, like us versus you, but are there other ways in which we can look and feel and where we stop having this exotifying gaze, because that's, it's just another form of violence that we're trying to resist.
Which is overflowed into us as well, in terms of, for instance, colorism. So that gaze is like something that we also carry within ourselves, of who is looked at as simple as who's more beautiful, or who gets to have the more privileges, or who doesn't. But I don't want to carry on too much. I want to know how much I am on time. So it's beautiful, it's like 3 minutes left.
It's beautiful, 3 minutes left. I'm always so curious, to hear like how people relate to this work. You know I rarely get to talk to anyone after post show. Everyone's always like running away from me. I'm like, oh my God, they're scared of me. And then, which is understandable too, I guess, in some ways. But yeah, for me, it's always helpful to hear what your experience was, because that's I don't only do it for us. I mean, in part, I mean, clearly it's a theater. There's an audience.
Hello, thank you for the performance. We had the opportunity to talk a little bit yesterday. But just briefly, I enjoyed the show, I would say mostly because I had the feeling that I could sit there and feel rather than start thinking first. And usually when I go into the theater to see performance art, in general in Europe, there's a lot of thinking and brain involved, and it's very rare that I don't know, emotions go through myself, or I have an experience of a different type. I usually feel like quite distant of what I'm seeing, and things can be quite interesting and you can reflect on them, but there's lacking a certain substance, I would say, you know. And yesterday I had completely the opposite experience, namely that I got into the space and I sat down, and my mind was like shut off for the whole length of the piece. I never really like thought anything about it. I was just, you know, going with it. And this is something I really miss. I understand that nowadays performing art or arts in general need to be like thought through, but I think there are different ways of thinking an art through, a work of art, and still maybe putting, I don't know, like you call it affect or emotion, like I would call it even substance. There are different ways to put that still in the front, you know, and then I don't know, the reflection can come afterwards. So I'm thankful for that. Yeah, that's it.
Do you want to?
Okay, I mean, I have background information, so this question is just so to open up to your work, basically, because I know this piece is the second part of a trilogy called Blue, Red, White, and I want to know from you what the first part is about and the latest part, and how they are related and your vision, basically.
Yeah. They're all sort of linked. Okay, so the first part, let me start with that, is Saraswag, which is takes place in a sort of immersive blue box, with one lone figure, a white male figure performs, and I use Jean-Louis' Antigone and Samuel Beckett's Not I as a backdrop and to the work, and through a kind of practice of embodiment, I also took like method act. Like there were a number of ways in which I was trying to play with a certain kind of embodiment and a shifty body in space to create a kind of unstable figure in the frame of the theater, and it takes place in this immersive blue with a live score performed by my twin brother, and that work is a sort of interrogation of sadness, and I was working on grief and sadness, and I started that work started with me sort of performing it, and then I transposed it to another performer, Brian Getnick, who's LA based, and it just is it's its own sort of little monster. It's a very isolated, lonely solo, and sort of meditation on sadness, and race is absolutely considered inside of the work. That was the starting point, and then Minor Matter in red, and then this last work is Water Will in white, and it's a melodrama. Melodrama is the point of departure, and it's me playing with a little bit it's kind of this idea of the like nature of the theater, and then this like the dubious relationship between nature, the feminine, blackness, and it's into like this like 19th century styled melodrama, theatrical work. It's very theatrical. I use mime as a way to develop material. So I joke that we're like miming for our lives inside of that work. And it was a way, this last piece in white was me also thinking, how could I really deal with, and I say this kind of kind of facetiously, like kind of in a funny way, like how do you account for 5 centuries of white terror on the way in which we understand a body? And I had to do it through a very it's a kind of tragic comedy in a way, in some ways, this last piece. It's like, it's really silly. It was the only way in which I could actually attend to something so grand and so grotesque. And so I use mime as a way to sort of very much illustrate terror and horror. And it's a black and white melodrama. And yeah, and the marking time sort of sonically still. So it's Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead is the main musical score that's kind of more like, it's kind of chopped and screwed. So it's like not even that understandable that it's Rachmaninoff's Isle of the Dead. It's really, everything is sort of abstracted through all these different ways, and it's a kind of hybrid. It's almost like a American, it's like there's like minstrel, it's like 19th century like theatrical practices, like minstrelsy, American minstrelsy, I guess, that comes out of like 19th century theater, very specific to Black American history, and a sort of hybrid with like German theater. And